Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Conway. I'm the director of the Museum of Work and Culture, and along with Morgan Graff, who is here with us this afternoon, who's the executive director of the Rhode Island Historical Society. We want to welcome you. We want to thank you for being here today. We have a really nice, beautiful, big crowd. And although I did recognize a few faces, we have a lot of new people joining us today. So special welcome to those who have never been to one of our virtual talks. Maybe you've never been to the Museum of Work and Culture. And let me just tell you a little bit about the museum. So we are located in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, right along the banks of the Blackstone River. We tell the story of immigration, the story of the French Canadian being the biggest, the largest group who immigrated to Woonsocket to come and work in the textile industry at the end of the 19th and at the beginning of 20th century. They were the largest group of immigrants, but our story is broader than that. Our story is really the story of all the people who came to Rhode Island to find a better life for themselves and their children. And I was speaking with Kerri and Rebecca before everybody came in. It is the story of and so similar to the stories of all the mill towns that we all know throughout New England. So, we are still closed to the public now, but hopefully we'll be reopened soon. And if you please take a minute to write in the chat where you are from. I heard somebody's from the UK. It's always great to know where you are joining us from, and we certainly keep track of that. That's very valuable, important information for us. Today we are joined by writers Kerri Arsenault and Rebecca Altman, who will present Paper or Plastic, Legacies of Work, Family, and Community. It will be a discussion of their work about North American manufacturing and the environmental, political, and personal legacies it has left behind. So this subject is particularly important for us at the museum as we have started to explore the ways to better tell the story of our the Blackstone River, one of America's hardest working river at one time, but one that also became one of the most polluted river. So I am again thrilled to welcome Kerri, who is a book critic, book editor at Orion Magazine, contributing editor at Literary Hub, and author of Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains. Milltown, this is the book here, and if you have not read it yet, you must. Her work has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, the NYRB, Freeman's, the Boston Globe, and Airmail. And Rebecca holds a PhD in environmental sociology from Brown University. Recent essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Aeon Magazine, and Orion Magazine, for whom she is currently guest editing a special series on plastics. The Song of Styrene is her first book and is forthcoming from Scribner's Books. And we will also be joined today by Johnathan Berard, who is the Rhode Island State Director for Clean Water Action. His advocacy portfolio includes toxics and chemical policy, and he has been working for the last 5 years to strengthen chemical policy in Rhode Island, including passing in 2017 the second strictest prohibition on organohalogens in flame retardants in the US. So welcome, Johnathan. Thank you for being with us as well. So Kerri and Rebecca, I'll turn the program to you.
Thank you so much. This has been a year in the making, this event. Sarah and I contacted each other quite a while ago. But I'll get into it. So paper or plastic, that question in the supermarket. What a choice. I'm still paralyzed when somebody asks. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book for those who don't know about it and sort of how it relates to Rebecca and Johnathan's work, and then they can jump into just a few minutes. So both Rebecca and I's work, or our books at least, contain really intimate stories about very unintimate things, plastic and paper. And these two inanimate objects have animated our work and our conversations on the page and on the phone for a few years. Right now, we talk to each other almost daily. And this intimacy, I feel like, is because paper and plastic are part of this global system of changing climate, pollution, industry, legacy, family, I don't know, you name it. And those systems are as complex a system as the human heart, which is also kind of at the heart of our books too. In fact, I think paper and plastic, for all you non-environmental people or academics, connects us all, really. And here's why. This is what I think. So if you look around the room that you're sitting in, because we're all at home, you can do this. How much white paper do you see? Seriously, though, make a list. Like if you can, just scratch it out. Write it down on a piece of paper or whatever. But I think once you start looking around, I mean, I see, my notebook, computer paper, I see a matte frame, I see a banana sticker I took off earlier. There's just like kind of no end to things that contain paper. And probably most of you know how paper is made in general, I think, but and maybe some of you, especially in this room, know how it's made white. But do you know who makes paper? Like anybody, take a guess. Because I do. I come from paper. My father, he worked in a paper mill for 45 years in Maine, as did my grandparents and great-grandparents. For over 100 years, paper was part of our daily bread. For breakfast, we breathed the eggy odor of the sulfur coming out of the mill, and that ka-chink of logs riding the conveyor belts to the wood chipper. It accompanied our lunch. Paper paid for the meatloaf we ate for supper, and at night, the hum of paper machines lullabied us to sleep. Paper also paid for my clothes, put me through college, gave me dignity, a future. I was a first-generation college student living out the American dream my family had worked really hard to achieve over 100 years, and it was all because of paper. But you know what paper also did? It probably killed my father and my grandfather and my grandmother and hundreds, maybe thousands of people in our community. Most paper mills use chlorine bleaching agents to make paper white. The resulting byproduct is one of the most dangerous family of toxics known to humankind, dioxins. People exposed to dioxins are more at risk for cancer and heart disease. Government, industry, lobbyists, the EPA, they won't admit this because they'll say it's hard to prove the link. But I see evidence in all those graves. Dioxin can impair, this is from Dick Clapp, or at least part of it. Dioxins can also impair fertility, sperm count, childhood development. They can damage or suppress immune systems, interfere with hormones, cause liver damage, infant cardiac malformations, neurodevelopment issues, accelerate female development, and harm unborn fetuses. And while I no longer live in Maine, I still carry the legacy of paper, and we all do, really. It's in our DNA, and here's why. More than 90% of human exposure to dioxins comes through our food supply and the fatty part of living things like pork, lobster, cows, and their byproducts like butter, milk, eggs, Parmesan cheese. And because dioxins bioaccumulate, the further up the food chain they travel, the more concentrated and toxic they become. At the very top of the food chain, human babies whose breastfeeding mothers can expose nursing infants to dioxin. I think it's like 77 times higher than the EPA recommends. 77 times, yeah. Dioxins are also persistent and they'll linger in the environment and in our bodies almost forever. Even in the tiniest amounts imaginable, they are enough to make us sick. As Rachel Carson made clear in Silent Spring, it's the little things that count. In fact, our body burden, the total amount of toxic chemicals present in our body, I think that's the right definition, is exactly that, the burden an individual must bear because our laws, our industries, our regulatory agencies can't or won't. In America, the fundamental need for bodies to be respected has always been at odds with industry's goals. History has shown these abuses to be true, from the cotton fields of Virginia to the rural mill towns of Maine to the textile mills of Rhode Island, where actually my grandfather had worked before he moved to Maine. He worked right in the area where that museum is. We have long let certain populations like these drift in the peripheries where we don't bother to look because they're no political or fiscal concern. Yet these people live on the front lines of environmental disaster, the razor's edge of social inequity, and at the ends of human dignity. They aren't killed directly. That would be too kind. I was just reading this paper by Tom Davies, which some of you know, but it made me think that they're kept in this state of gradual and perpetual injury, exposed to the possibility of death at all times. So the next time, you see a piece of paper, don't just think of my family, but of your own. So like the Rhode Island Museum, Milltown is about broader things than just one town. It's about all towns and beyond New England too. And it's also about identity, which is something Rebecca's work is also about, the question, who am I, which seeded my book and sort of seeded hers, I think, and maybe she'll disagree, but I spent 18 years trying to find out what those missing links in my family tree are, to understand what the absences could mean. And then when I met Rebecca, I saw too, she was interrogating these same things, that paper and plastic were actually linked to, not just materially, but the way they arced through history and in our families, and that we were complicit too with these environmental problems themselves, making the very things, our families, her dad, my dad, making the very things that could be killing us. Rebecca too, the PhD, I'm just going to read this, with PhD focused on the effects of persistent pollutants and environmental legacies on the human body, with a father whose work at Union Carbide foretold Altman's eventual career and obsessions, her work as an environmental sociologist, and her skill as a graceful and generous writer. This is also a story Rebecca had to tell, like me. What do you think, Rebecca?
Well, I'm so grateful, Kerri, that you invited me here with you. I cannot speak. I'm very emotional about this book. When I finished it, I was in deep silence for a very long time. And I called Kerri in that deep silence and I could barely speak to her. It's just been such an honor to watch this come into the world. I'm so grateful to have someone else who's kind of thinking in this emergent group of writers who have taken it on to examine the legacies of 20th century industry at multiple scales, from body to family to community and beyond. So it's been a pleasure to watch you work there. And it's truly, this is a return as well for me. My family, generations back, came from Woonsocket. And it's not a history I know particularly well. And that's part of a Milltown story too, I suppose, isn't it? It's this idea of returning. I come from a family that split the divides of ethnicity, language, and class. My grandmother was French Canadian and an orphan, and was raised by her grandfather, who at times was the mayor of Woonsocket, was a mill president for a while, Roland Worsley, and a real estate developer. And my father's father was son of Polish immigrants who lived in a store on over top a store on South Street. And I don't know how they made rent, but I'm guessing millwork. I know a little bit that millwork was part of that. So my dad left Rhode Island in 1962 after attending URI on scholarship. He studied chemical engineering. He left Rhode Island for New Jersey to make plastics for a company called Union Carbide. He made a particular kind of plastic called polystyrene. And he also made some of the precursor materials to make Bakelite plastic, which is significant because it was the breakthrough commercial synthetic plastic. It was the bangles that went up Coco Chanel's arm. It was the telephone, the radio casing. And he was working at the factory that was the initial US-based flagship for bakelite production built during the Depression. At one time, Carbide boasted this was the epicenter of world plastics. They said that in 1953 in their advertising. That's advertising, so I don't know if that's accurate, but they thought so.
Hey, advertising, it's all true, whatever they say,
And he did that for a period of 10 years, and then he left. So when I was growing up, he managed my hometown, and he managed the town's recycling. And the irony is not lost on me sometimes. And my dad is here.
I know. How is that strange? Oh, we can talk about that later. Yeah.
Well, yes. But recycling centers are sometimes called redemption centers, and the irony of that name is not lost on me. Anyway, 40 years after my dad left Rhode Island to make plastics, I moved to Rhode Island to study their legacy. And it was a bumpy journey, and it wasn't quite obvious to me, and I bumbled along trying to figure it out. My dad eventually took me back to see his plant in New Jersey, and we watched parts of it get torn down and toured it. And it was people on this call who convinced me that I needed to keep pursuing this, that there was a story here that needed to be told, or that could be told, about this more intimate side of plastics production. And I'm very grateful for all of them. Dick Fox is here. He's the dioxin expert that Kerri referred to. He played a big part of that. And Carolyn Raffensperger is on the call. She's an environmental lawyer.
Your voice is fading just a little. Come closer. Come closer.
Come closer. Madeline Scammell, another epidemiologist on the call, just convinced me that we needed to be writing about plastics in this more intimate, narrative, storied way. And so I'm very grateful that I'm on this journey now with Dad and with folks, mentors like Kerri. But I wanted to talk a little bit about paper and plastic.
Yes.
It's always posed at the grocery store as this binary. How do you want your goods packaged, paper or plastic? Which totally cuts out mill towns like Woonsocket, because one of the other options is your cloth bag.
Right.
There's no implications from all of it. But what's interesting to me about plastics is if you look in their history, plastics began as tree products, as agricultural products. If you think about latex rubber, gutta percha was harvested from trees in Southeast Asia, causing massive environmental ruin and awful environmental violence. And that is how the British Empire coded their undersea telegraph cables to administer their empire. That was a tree product. Even Bakelite, early on, the formaldehyde to make the Bakelite was derived through methanol from charcoal, which is from wood. And wood flour was metered in as well. There's many examples of that, and we can talk about that. And then as plastics split off and became derivatives of oil and gas, you might think then paper and plastic diverge, but all you have to do is consider your classic cafe cup. Sure, you have the polystyrene or polypropylene lid and your paper cup, and they work together. But if, as my friends at the University of Toronto will tell you, you soak this paper cup in a bowl of water and you rub it a little bit, what you get, here, I deconstructed a cup for you, ready? An interior plastic lining. There it is, polyethylene.
That's terrible. That is just.
Cup. I did it with a Dunkin' Donuts cup, so there's no brand favoritism going on. Even Kerri's mill, as she explains in Milltown, they would make glossy magazine paper. And that gloss is part of the plastic story as well. And so, this idea that these materials are separate and that these mill towns, the regulations could deal with one industry at a time, one contaminant at a time, and yet so much of the world is multi-materials. Metal cans have plastic linings. Washable wool is coated in plastic. I mean, these are multi-layered materials creating places that are also multi-layered.
Right, right.
So when you think of Woonsocket as a mill town, it was a many milled town. It had, there was a rubber done outwards here, cotton and wool, and then the synthetics came in. Some of the mills, for example, converted over to Tupperware. One of the things I'm surprised to learn is that my own great-grandfather worked at the Blackstone Cotton Mill, was one of the Lonsdale mills, and that converted over to Tupperware production. I mean, you start pulling these threads and it all ends in paper or plastic, Kerri, right?
It's paper or plastic, and it all ends on a river too, somewhere. Like it's all connected to a river somewhere along the way, because those mills were all built on rivers too.
Which makes me want to talk about, so this is the Androscoggin River that runs through Kerri's book. It runs through Kerri's childhood. I went to college on this river, and my mom's family grew up not far from this river. But we all benefited from what happened to this river, and it's a story that Kerri tells in the book because it even mattered to the fate of the Blackstone River. The fate of this river affected U.S. Senator Edmund Muskie, who also grew up along this river, and he carried that river story to the halls of, to D.C., to the Senate chambers, and it was the Androscoggin that helped inspire the Clean Waters Act, and the work that Johnathan is even doing today with clean water action on Rhode Island.
Hey, do you have a piece of paper over your microphone?
No. Is it really hard to hear me?
Not anymore.
Oh, I do maybe have a piece of paper.
What do you know? I did that on purpose.
Sorry.
See what paper can do?
So did I miss a lot of that?
No, I mean, we could hear, yes, I could hear it. Some people could not, depending on.
Sorry, everybody.
No, it's okay. It's all right. Somebody just had that idea. Yeah, that river that Ed Muskie grew up on, yeah, the Androscoggin, and saw in all its polluted glory, and penned the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. I mean, that river was so like primal to sort of everything in this book, the research, as you know, Rebecca, we've talked about this, how it, like, the literal research of my book took on the likeness of a dirty river. It was like, it just went out like a multiplying cancer cell or a family tree or a dirty river. It was also, as I was doing that research, which the book itself shows me doing the research, it was like the book is like an aggregate of everything that I found, like a river does when it like starts to dump the sediment into the sea, or how dioxin accumulates. That's the other body of water, right? Our bloodstream. That bloodstream is like the river, or like the DNA strand. But I'm sorry, I'm getting too metaphorical. I can't help it. My head is there.
But there's a scene that Kerri writes in this book about the Androscoggin needing oxygen. And she parallels that with her father also requiring oxygen. And two of those together, very evocative scene, and also very telling.
Yeah, I mean, they put for a while, they put bubbler, just like the Blackstone. Did I say this? Maybe I did. I don't know. Maybe I thought it. But when Anne was saying the Blackstone was one of the most polluted rivers, the Androscoggin was like the top 10 polluted rivers in the US in 1973, when I was 5 or 6, whatever that is. One of the most polluted rivers. And yeah, they had to put bubblers in it to feed oxygen into the river. And they would do all this testing and poking and prodding of the river to test the dioxin levels and the oxygen levels. And I thought, and then when my father got sick with esophageal cancer and lung cancer, which was during the middle of this book, it wasn't the impetus of the book. I should tell people, it's not like a father death story necessarily. But they started doing the same thing to him, pump, an oxygen tank in the other room. And also that oxygen tank, not to go off too much of a tangent, but that was also that same idea. It was like the possibility of death. I always felt like when I was with him, when he had that thing tethered to him, it was in the other room. I always felt like it was going to, like, even though it was giving him life, it was like this thing that could just blow up, somebody light a match. I don't know, just that possibility of death was like always on his back. it's like a bullseye. When he was working, when he was living, when he was dying, you know, like the river, the same thing, the possibility of death. I mean, we had all the fish in the river died. There was zero oxygen. How can anything live with zero oxygen? It's pretty elemental.
Mm.
Anyway, sorry, I don't know where I was talking about. But that movement too of the river, you know, not to go down the river metaphor, but that movement of an eddying river, like, is the plot of my book. And I think a little bit of the plot of your work too, of your book, of the coming and going of home or family, the back and forth, and the sort of recalibrating what it all means every time you touch upon it, or whether every conversation you have with your father, or every time you do a research project, because I know how you research and how you dig through. You're constantly calibrating and recalibrating.
Yeah, it becomes inseparable at some point.
It becomes inseparable. Yes.
Yeah, I think my interest in plastics came out of wanting to connect with my dad, who I'm close with, but just like plastics, something can be familiar and yet still quite inscrutable. And it was something to probe. It was part of this life that he had before me, that he had left. And so I was always trying to figure that out. But in learning about plastics through him and with him, I've learned so much more about him, including about where he comes from and about Woonsocket and where his, you know, all that he carries from the generations that preceded him. And I'm often like, it becomes impossible to write about him without plastics, you know, or to just even be tumbling down some historical record and like, or some family record, and then boom, I'm looking at plastics again. It's like, it's this.
I understand completely. It's like, I can't even like pick up a piece of paper. I should tell everybody too that my book is printed on paper that is not using organochlorines or chlorine bleaching agents. I put that in my contract because I would never be able to look at my book. Although the cover, as we discussed just the other day, has that nice glossy streak, which probably has some kind of plastic polymer thing on it, right? It's like a spot gloss, who knows? Anyway, always connected. I can't look at paper in the same way, or history in the same way, because I feel like the book, my book, your book, and the work that we're doing is not just a history of our families and about our rivers and about these industries, but it's about the environmental history of not just the United States, but the entire world. Like, because we start at the beginning of the industry, and then we come through, and here we are now with reckoning with that, to use the subtitle of my book, you know, but it's the history of the environmental history of the world. Not to like put too much confidence in my work. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it just follows that arc of history through people, which we talked about is important. Like, not just following industry. Who wants to read about a boiler? I certainly did not, even though I had to, like, but I would rather read about humans in that history.
We were talking the other day, there's a chapter late in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring called Through a Narrowed Window, or Through a Narrow Window. And it's very evocative because, you know, sometimes you think, well, what does my one story matter? Or how can you use one object and then kind of use it to kind of examine such large concepts? But Rachel was writing about, like, if you have a window that's narrow and open and you look at it from a distance, all you see is like the thinnest sliver of light, maybe a blur of motion or color. But if you get up really close and you look through that same narrowed window, like, so much more is possible to see. And so to set this frame of saying, I'm going to write about paper and manufacturing through the lens of my father and grandfather in this one town, it becomes possible to then really examine so much more than would be possible if you stood back and said, I'm going to write a book about the paper industry or the plastics industry.
Yeah, and that's kind of related too to the coming and going, right? The being near and the being far. That same tension is to being close to something and to being farther away. And I don't think I could have written this book any earlier than I did, because of that. You had to have that distance. I mean, it's also like we're both witnesses and participants in this sort of thing. And we're both advocates and critics too, I think. I am, at least of my town, I'm its biggest critic, but I'm also its biggest advocate. And that just keeps going, that tension, that back and forth. And it's also critical, I think, to tell that story, because it isn't a one-sided story. It's not like the paper mill is bad, therefore it must shut down. It's making dioxins. Look what it did. Look what it's doing. Are we going to end paper consumption anytime soon? I don't think so. It might end in Maine sooner than most, but it's not going to end because of my book or anything.
Yeah.
What was I going to ask? Speaking of taking a lens, I just want to have you briefly talk, because it's such a fascinating point that you're working on, is how you summon Primo Levi in your book and why. Just a little bit. I know it's complicated.
No. So my book is going to be a braided narrative similar to Kerri's, in that it weaves in the personal narrative with kind of sociological science history. But I pulled in a third thread, kind of a literary biography of the writer Primo Levi, which most people associate with his writing about Auschwitz and the Holocaust. But Primo Levi actually made plastics, if you have a kind of a broad understanding of what plastics are. So like not this kind of plastics, but he made remember I was talking about wire coatings?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So he was making the kind of plastics that would go on wires, and he did that for 30 years. So he was a phenomenal chemist, and wrote often from that perspective. And so I found myself turning to him while trying to write because he was using the chemistry and the chemical elements and the chemical processes to explain human nature. And eventually it got to the point where he'd been such a mentor for me that I couldn't help but not write about him as well. And so we don't have a lot of stories about paper makers or about plastics makers.
Right.
And so I was thought to bring kind of two of their stories to the page, two different generations, two different cultures, two different fields, and yet these lives intimately touched with this material have a lot to say about what it means to work plastic and what plastic might mean to the world. So I wove him in. I hope it works.
We'll see. Everybody in this call is going to hold you to that.
Yeah.
But there was something you said to me a while ago too about that, and I like this, and I like everything you say sort of feels like I'm like, oh, she's talking about me, because it's like our work was so in sync, like in that way. But you said there were certain carbon-rich plastics that hold on to carbon, and that's I'm probably saying this wrong, so scientists forgive me, but they are out of sync with Earth's systems, and they're incompatible with nature in that they can alter nature, which I thought was, just like pollutants themselves can alter the human heart and like the actual heart, I just thought that was really, maybe I made that up. Did I make that up?
The essay that introduced me to his work and that endeared me to him is actually an essay called Carbon, and it is the final chapter in his book, The Periodic Table, which the Royal Institution of London, I believed, called one of the finest bits of science writing from the 20th century. Carbon is a beautiful essay, and it is about the carbon cycle. But in other writings, he talks about plastics being a little too, that they don't return to the plastic cycle, and they kind of mess with that ancient logic of returns.
Oh, like we were just talking about
Yeah.
Speaking of the ancient logic of returns.
Oh.
Also connected with Johnathan Berard, who's patiently waiting here somewhere. this book, all three of us are connected by a French-Canadian heritage, or this we kind of each mentioned slightly. In my book, it's a little more explicit. And that ancient, it just made me think that ancient point of return is like the Acadian Aboteau, I think I'm pronouncing that right, were these wood sluices that would like, they put them up in Nova Scotia, and the seawater would come in, and it would help make the land more fertile. These ancient sluices. It was an idea of leaving and returning the ocean water. Isn't that amazing? It connects too with that same idea, which also makes me think of in our stories and in the way plastics and paper act, that people are always like, oh, when did you decide to write about this? I'm like, I don't know. Who knows? Like, you don't decide. You also don't decide on like that because of the way plastics and paper behave. I feel like there is no sort of beginning or end to their, not just their story, but the way they act in the body, or the way we can't connect the toxics that they make or whatever to disease. It's like kind of that movement. I'm just picturing like a wave, the ocean wave going in and out of the Aboteau. There's no beginning or end. It's just going in and out and in and out. The return and leaving. Anyway.
Which makes a book a linear narrative.
Right.
Very hard to write.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. So forgive us up front. There is no plot in my book. Sorry. Yeah. And Johnathan too. Yeah. He lives in Woonsocket currently. He returned. That was what I was getting to. He returned to Woonsocket to live and sort of shore up his family legacy too, in a way, I think. Although I only met him briefly, like the other day and online, just briefly, after he sent me a very nice email.
Is he unmuted? Can he join us?
I'm unmuted.
Hey.
Hi. Yeah. So I don't know where you want me to start, but yeah, Kerri's right. I mean, we just met a couple of days ago. I read her book because I am from a mill town and or next door to one. I grew up in Cumberland, but went to high school here. I could stand in my backyard and throw a baseball. It could land in Woonsocket. So I just connected a lot with Milltown, and just the work that I do, working in chemical policy and plastics policy and all sorts of other environmental policy. It just tied a lot of strings together for me reading that book. And, I just wanted to let Kerri know what an amazing story she had. And now I'm here talking.
I was like, come on the show with us. Because I don't know anything. I mean, Johnathan comes from, comes from the same history I come from, but also a place of policy, which, people are always asking me, and I don't know about you, Rebecca, but, what can we do? I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, stop voting for leaders who want to kill you. That's one thing you can do. But also there's I don't know what I was going to say. Somebody else talk. I'm hearing myself talk too much.
No. Well, I thought it was great for that Johnathan read, Milltown in this many milled town, and I would love to hear him talk about regulating after the fact all of these industries that got a head start by, in some cases, 150 years or more, and then trying to kind of come at this retrospectively about how do you get a river to breathe again? How do you deal with these layers of legacy that are built into a place of Woonsocket, from the time of the dyes to the synthetics to the plastics to the rubber, all layered.
And I want to pile on to that question. Johnathan, I hope you're ready.
Oh boy, I'm writing this down.
Write it all down. No, it's more blah, blah from me. But to pile on to that question, also facing those legacies are things like in my book, somebody pointed out the other day, and I'd forgotten I'd written it, but Angus King, who's now Maine senator, when he was governor of Maine, he was at this conference with about 40 paper industry officials. It was like 1995. And he said, "You'd make my life easier if you could just figure out a way to get rid of dioxin." And after that, no dioxin breakout sessions were had, and the EPA cancer risk study on dioxin was shelved. So it literally did go away. So there's a silencing too of things that, so to add to the problems that Rebecca's outlining. Anyway.
Well, Kerri, you kind of answered the question, and it's vote
Did?
for people who are going to pass laws. I mean, the only real way to reckon with all of this is to regulate industry from putting any more of this stuff into our environment, into our economy, into our bodies. And then, obviously there's cleanup that needs to be done. And, in some places it will happen naturally, maybe not in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our children, but eventually it may get there. But, the first step is to turn the tap off. And, in all of the policy work that, I do, Rebecca, your father was in, the recycling business for a while, and for years, all we hear is, if only we recycled, it's the way we're going to do stuff. And when we're saying, our recycling system is broken and we have so much waste, and that blame gets, to use the river metaphor, that blame gets assigned downstream. It gets assigned to the end users. And at the end of the day, the social, environmental, economic costs are borne by us, taxpayers, municipalities, and the companies responsible for putting this stuff out into the market, can literally just wash their hands of it. And, this has happened for 150 years of history. We've been talking about this, and Kerri, you wrote about in your book, and Rebecca, you're writing about in your book. This is true everywhere. And so that's a classic tactic that, it's like, if only we recycled more, if only people did the right thing, if only we threw more money at education, if onlys, and all of that ire is directed downstream, and that's the wrong direction. And so,
sorry, go ahead.
No, and so the only way you're going to get that to happen is by elected officials making policy and enacting regulations to stop it.
Okay, so I did know something, but so interesting what you said about the river is like the problem that we're all talking about, but it's also a solution. You're saying like, don't, how did you say that? Upstream, downstream. How did you say that? That was...
Yeah, I think upstream, downstream. Sometimes we call them end of pipe solutions, but that's the thing. It's turning the tap off. Like, and yeah. The plastic pollution is a perfect example of that. I've been doing plastics work for a long time, and there's not always a connection between marine plastic and microplastic pollution and the things that we do in our daily lives, the things that we use. And we know that a plastic bag can sometimes get in the river, but we don't understand how that connection happens. Like the things that we buy in the store and the giant swirling garbage gyres in the middle of the ocean, what's the connection? And so rivers are the connection. That's what brings all of that stuff into the ocean and breaks it down into microplastics. And as always, I have my microplastic sample from Narragansett Bay with me, as I always do. And so making those connections, we've talked a lot about connections today. That is really powerful. And I didn't do my I did a microplastics trawl in Narragansett Bay in the summer of 2017, and it wasn't to. I know there's a lot of scientists on the call. It wasn't really a sciencey trawl. It was to bring light to the problem. It was an advocacy tool, and now real scientists are actually doing the trawling, which is great. But whenever I pass this jar around, it just wows everyone, from a small child to a elected official, because it puts them face to face with that problem. And to use the river metaphor once again, especially with the Blackstone, we oftentimes we don't look at it. We kind of drive over it, and our buildings are to the back of it, and that's just the pattern of development we had, and we've put all of our stuff in there, uncovering that and making it visible to people is really important. So identifying the problem and identifying what the actual solutions are, I think, are two big steps.
I love that you said that, making it visible too, because that is really part of the problem of these things that I saw. And I have just a technical question for you. And you can't, I'm sure you can answer it, and one of the millions of other scientists on this call can, but recycling, doesn't it, I think about recycling paper, for instance, doesn't that use a lot more sort of resources? like water and then bleach and de-inking, and doesn't it, like, I was looking at this, Rebecca and I got on a tear yesterday about coated paper, in fact, because they use a kale and clay, which come to find out is radioactive. This guy did this experiment I was reading about, and he tore up all these magazines and put it in a beaker, and then they did some radioactive, it's friggin' radioactive. What about recycling? What, is that a good idea?
I mean, it depends what you're recycling. There's, recycling paper is, I mean, I don't know the back end of it, and maybe some scientists do, but I mean, one thing that we face a lot is something called pyrolysis, and that's basically burning plastics to get rid of it. And so right now we're fighting a medical waste plant here in Rhode Island that's either about to be sited or going through the permitting process, and it's billed as renewable energy.
Yes, they're doing that with tires in my mill. They're burning tires for fuel for the whole mill.
Yep, it's literally burning fossil fuels, and it's an extractive, horrible, process from extraction, to literally burning plastic, which creates, air pollution that, like, per unit of power produced is worse than burning coal.
Right.
So,
that's what, and I guess there's loopholes in the laws, at least what I was reading. I could hardly follow the tire burning debacle, because it seems like they also changed terms with it. It used to be called tire derived fuels, and then they changed it from a fuel to a special fuel. I don't know. It's like all kinds of linguistics gymnastics that made it impossible for me to follow. Sorry, we have so much to talk about. We should
open it up to questions, though.
Do we have questions? Are people asking questions?
So no one has entered a question in the chat so far, other than someone asking to share links to the books, which I will be emailing all registrants an amazing book list that was put together by Kerri and Rebecca tomorrow, along with a link to this recording. So you will get those. Someone just asked a question. It says, it is from Catherine Silberman, and it says, I'm working with a resident coalition to oppose the medical waste pyrolysis plant. If anyone would like to sign our opposition letter, please contact me. And then she also put her email in the chat.
Great.
I have a question for everybody. If there's anybody that does know about tire I can't even pronounce it, burning tires for fuel, can you please contact me? Here's my email. The only person I spoke to was a lobbyist for the tire industry.
We have a question from Tracy, who says, can any of you share with us the impact of these paper and plastic toxins on animals?
I think same, right? All the stuff I said about, at least about dioxin. I mean, dioxin really is just kind of for me, it was just one. There's many, many toxics coming out of paper making that I didn't list. I do actually have a list. Let me see, wait, it's right here. Hold on. Dioxin, cadmium, benzene, lead, naphthalene, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, arsenic, furans, trichlorobenzene, chloroform, asbestos, mercury, phthalates. Those are a few, anyway, of modern day paper making. And here's a few of the diseases, human diseases: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, lung cancer, prostate cancer, aplastic anemia, liver cancer, esophageal cancer, asbestosis, Ewing sarcoma, emphysema, cancer of the brain, cancer of the heart, at least those in my hometown. So I think that if that's happening to humans, it's going to be happening to animals. And then we eat the animals, and then we get it more.
Great. Jessica Lee asks, I'd love to hear you speak a bit about why it's so vital we make these environmental legacy stories personal, and the value of telling those stories through family stories.
Yeah, because, go ahead, Rebecca. You want to...
Well, Jessica Lee's book, Two Trees Make a Forest, is one of my other favorite reads of the year. So we're really lucky to have her with us. She's an environmental historian that also tells these kinds of stories. I highly recommend Two Trees Make a Forest. And what a provocative question. It's a really big challenge to, I don't know. I mean, this is where Kerri and I come at this from such interesting directions. You know, I'm trained as a sociologist and not to write in the narrative I, and Kerri is trained with an MFA in creative writing. And we both come at these incredibly difficult stories to tell scientifically and also personally from different places. I do believe, though, that learning how to tell better environmental stories, and I know this is really important to Kerri, and is something I'm constantly figuring out how to do. I think they enter through a different portal. I think they do.
It's not even just personal stories. It doesn't even have to be about me. It has to be about humans and human heart. And I don't mean like a reporter helicopter and going into a town for a few days and then writing about people. I mean, it has to be like straight through the heart, and people, meeting people where they are in their lives and telling a story. And it doesn't have to be tragic. It could be full of, John Freeman's got this great anthology called Tale of Two Planets out, and there's a lot of really funny stories in there about, and it covers climate crisis. But they touch the human heart in some way or another. So it's not that reportage. It's not the, I think that's what's happening, or I'd like to see happen more in environmental writing than just the strict scientific. And I want all you scientists to write these stories somehow. I will help you write them if you please write them, because people need to, and I'm the person that doesn't know the information. So I come to you, and there's so many people on this call, including Rebecca and Johnathan now, who have helped me understand the science, and Dick Clapp behind some of this. So, and to me, I just see it becomes all clear once the science is there. I don't know. I just think it's something that writers need to really think about, because climate crisis, environmental crisis is really the biggest crisis right now that we face. There's no argument from me on that.
And I think that it also does two things. I mean, you have a scale issue. So a lot of the environmental issues that are going on are happening at multiple scales. And so this idea of global change, global plastics. But if you can bring the kind of global down into the scale of a human life, you can see its unevenness because harm is not evenly distributed. But you can also kind of work those scales to make them more evident. And then there's the issue of just how much of this is a slow moving disaster, or slow violence, to use Rob Nixon's term. These aren't disasters that go boom and are spectacular and make the news. These are slow moving accretive disasters that almost happen at another scale, that almost feels outside of human time. And you have to find a way to represent what harm looks like and feels like in a way that registers. And so again, this intimate kind of history storytelling is trying to get at that.
It's almost like redefining what spectacular means too in the process, like to write the slow, quiet story about a slow, quiet, scary, looming, toxic disaster that is, how did I say? That's Tom Davies' paper, that is causing perpetual non-deliberate injury to people. Like how to write that makes it spectacular, that people aren't like bored because there's no plot, or to try to figure that out is a lot of thinking to do there, that writers. Anyway, I could go on in fact, I am going to go on for days about it, because I'm going to teach a class on it to academics, environmental academics, in the summer. University of Oregon, stay tuned. So Dick Clapp asks, can Kerri talk a little about how or why the voters of Mexico, Maine voted for Trump last year? I can talk a little bit, or I can talk for like days, but basically, as I said, these towns like this and people like this have been pushed to the periphery. And I was only talking environmentally, but it's been for over 50, 60 years, fiscally and culturally, starting when I was a kid. Well, no, starting even before that, possibly starting when the Industrial Revolution started. I mean, there was no real American dream when people were being poisoned, maybe they were making a living, but there's just been a lot of suffering and a lot of ambiguity, which goes back to what we were talking about too, a lot of ambiguity in these towns about what, is there any way that they can, is there any way they can survive this? Because if their manufacturing can't survive, their livelihoods don't survive, and their identities aren't going to survive. So voting for Trump was actually their last ditch at hope. And I really understood it, because they have been going on for 50, 60 years with nothing changing, just getting worse and worse and worse. And in comes Trump, who has this sort of false bravado, talking like, in a no nonsense kind of way that Mainers, or at least people in my town, understand. There's also a history there with Trump, who, we felt was, when I was a kid, we're like, he was rich. This is something we wanted to be. So he comes in with his, false bravado and saying all this stuff, saying he came into our town and he said, I'm going to help you, even though he didn't mean it, and he didn't help anybody but himself. But to say it to them, to see them and say it was something. And there's no understating of that I mean, overstating. Anyway, it was a huge thing for him to sort of address the working class directly. That's the short of it. It's really complicated, but I don't want to take the next 20 minutes talking about it. But you can read it in my book. Actually, there's a little bit of it too. I wrote an essay called My 86 Jobs in the New York Review of Books about when I was 15, I started working, and I'm still working. So I've had 86 jobs. This is my 87th one, being an author. But it kind of goes through that arc of why somebody would be so frustrated. It's about the working class, that essay. Anyway.
So Dick's question has a second part, which is, second, does green chemistry and or alternatives assessment offer a way out of this endless cycle?
I'll let anybody else answer that.
I mean, it's so green chemistry is actually a PhD granting field now, in which chemists are taught the basics of toxicology, endocrinology, so that they understand these biochemical properties of the materials they're making, so they can design better. This was not a traditional part of chemical education. And so there's this idea that molecules can be made more benign by design and with the end in mind. I'm sorry for all the rhyming there, but that's the idea. And I think that work is ongoing. And it's interesting to think about, because with plastics, because plastics, most are produced from oil and gas, with the byproducts of oil and gas development, what's going to happen as the energy sectors and transit sectors transition off of that, and the kind of economy and the pricing of these feedstocks change? How are we going to make medicines and heart valves and things like that? And so this field is becoming even more important. How else are we going to kind of make these materials of every day, while also making other materials more benign by design? I mean, there's a major shift happening, not just in the energy sector. It has to happen in the materials and manufacturing sector as well. That says nothing about all the plastics that's already here and the legacy that's already here. You know, much of the legacy we're dealing with that has been banned, and yet on it goes. You know, transferred through breast milk or eaten with meals. But all solutions are required, I suppose, as you know, Dick, better than any of us.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Susan Eastman, who asks, maybe you could discuss how it has always become a struggle or choice between jobs and environment. It's always in the corporate industry playbook.
I would say it's never a choice. It's an inevitability. There's no choice between something and nothing. That's no choice at all. There's something I wrote, when I saw your question, I looked at my book, because sometimes my book answers the question better than I can, because I have no memory. But I wrote, humans generally prefer unambiguous situations. We like to know what's around the corner, in our lungs, in our water, or in the wind. We like to know what evidence we can depend on. So our choices about where we live, how we act or don't act, are based on fact, not fear, and emotion sometimes as irrational as flowers that have no scent. If we're told one thing and another, this is after, you know, when you're told one thing then another and nothing at all by various parties who are party to the questionable deeds, you know, it accentuates this overall feeling of suspicion, which is already it's just as debilitating as worrying about the viability of your already tenuous job or your health, right? So if you've got, you know, environmental regulators, scientists, mill doctors, mill managers all saying that, you know, local cancers are within the normal range, that risks can be controlled, that industry is not to blame, and we're not to worry about things we can't see, like pollution that's hovering over our town. Well, how is there even a choice? We don't even know we're making a choice. I don't know. That's the best I can say about that. Anybody else want to say anything?
I mean, there's a long history of that dichotomy being set up, and a long history of effectively pulling that apart and saying it's always more complicated than this or that. It's not just paper or plastic or a job or the environment. Because I'm remembering the writer, Sandra Steingraber, said the root of economy, ecos, and the root of ecology, they're the same. There is, you know, at some point, all jobs come from the environment. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive things, and that argument has just been trotted out for a long time and is well documented by historians and sociologists and allied fields, and is worth kind of trying to kind of needle apart. Why is it set up like that?
It's like you needled apart that coffee cup. What's paper or plastic?
Put it in water and rub right
together. I mean, there's no choice. You choose both when you choose it, in a way, especially with the long history of paper and plastic being created together.
No, by all means, go ahead, Jonathan.
I'm muted, sorry. And just to add on to that, I mean, just from the policy perspective, I think, you know, that Kerri, you said the something or nothing, and I think that's the mindset that folks, especially that are in jobs that would be affected by a turn towards a greener economy, you know, that's what they've been told for decades, is that if these types of policies are passed and we move in this direction, then you will have nothing for yourself or your family. And, you know, we know that that is not true. And, you know, only as of late has that really been, you know, part of the national conversation. But even still, we hear it from corporate lobbyists every day. We see it in the, political contributions to our leaders at every level of government. And so, you know, that aspect of it, it can't just be argued away. And it's important that, you know, we write about it and we read about it and we talk about it, you know, but also there's that, like, there's the money aspect, and it's not in the interests of large corporations to shake up the status quo, whether it's banning plastics, whether it's, you know, turning away from fossil fuels, whether it's, banning certain chemicals from being in products. It's a change, and for a long time we've heard that change is bad, and change is bad for you and your family, and that argument has won the day thus far. And so that narrative's changing, but it's still very persistent.
Yeah, and I would say that the thing between something or nothing is more really just, you either have a job in this town, in my town, you either have a job or you don't. It was more like really basic on that level, but I like what you just said. It's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We have a question from Connor Gearin, who says, following Rebecca's thoughts, which happened a little while ago, but following Rebecca's thoughts about issues at multiple scales, how would you respond to some people's, not mine, argument that putting energy into local pollution conservation issues takes away from the energy that could go into larger scale climate movement?
I don't know. I feel like it's all contributory. No, I mean, if you think of climate and plastics work as branches on the same tree. I mean, they both have roots in fossil fuel extraction. And so all of that capillary work happening out in the branches is contributing to all of it. I think this is an all hands on deck kind of moment. So I don't know if I understand that argument. I think I'd better learn it better to be able to speak to it. Let's keep talking about that. Johnathan, is that an argument that you have encountered at the State House here or elsewhere?
No, not really. And I think you're right, Rebecca. I think everything is contributory. So no matter if you're working to pass a bag ban in your town, or you're part of a national organization fighting large scale, working to enact, large scale renewable energy projects across the United States, I think every little bit counts, because your tree metaphor is exactly right. And, the plastics and the climate change are inextricably linked, especially as, we move towards renewables and away from fossil fuels. The petrochemical companies have their wagons now hitched to plastic, and if we don't change something, they're projecting that from today's production levels, we'll see 2 to 3 times more plastic in our economy by 2050,
Right.
and that's problematic because we can't deal with the plastic we have now. So
here's something you can all do right now. There's 53 people still, 63, I can't see. Just stop drinking water out of plastic bottles. Like there's some, because it uses both paper and plastic. Just stop doing it right now unless you really have to. There are cases where you have to. There's a small thing. If every community just started, that's what I tell people. They always get very distraught, like, what can I do? I'm like, dude, start there. Start in your town. Stop allowing it to happen, and just inform and educate people about what plastic bottles do to not just the people that are drinking out of it, the people who make it anyway. So the little things count. They do.
Especially when you take that action and you reach one level beyond yourself. So like, what are the concentric circles in which you dwell? So you have your house, but maybe your job or your community or your university or an outward. I mean, I was watching some of the coverage of the US Senate, and there was the Senate Minority Leader speaking, and right behind him on camera over his left shoulder was a plastic bottle of water. And I know one of the policy issues that some of the plastics groups are working on now is to change the purchasing practices of large buyers like the US government. What would it mean if the US government stopped purchasing bottled water and in favor of going back to glasses and pitchers?
And
what if impact?
And what if all the government and all the universities used non-chlorine bleached paper? What if the government alone did it, or publishers, or that's the market. So we can vote, we can change legislation, and we can also make market demands.
Yeah, and if you want to help, speaking as someone who works for an advocacy organization that works on procurement policies, we're working with the cities of Providence and Newport on just that issue. There's if besides stopping yourself from drinking disposable water bottles, there's probably a group out there that's working on this stuff, whether it's plastics or whether it's open space or water pollution, whatever. There's groups out there. Find them, give them money, volunteer your time, testify at hearings. Like, that's all stuff that you can do that's within your power. It seems like a really overwhelming challenge, all of this, but those little tiny ripples, as Robert Kennedy said one time, they all add up. And so,
or even just going to your town water district meetings, finding out what's going on.
Or support the communities that are on the fence lines.
All of that stuff.
All of it.
Yeah. Great. So I'm going to do one last question, which comes from Tracy, who says, what do you all think about the country shifting towards bioregionalism, undamming rivers, working with Indigenous nations for sustainability? Is this part of your conversation?
I don't know much about undamming rivers. But in the world of plastics, there's a wonderful scholar named Max Lieberman out of the island of Newfoundland. And they have a book coming out like imminently from Duke University Press called Pollution is Colonialism. And the premise there, the argument there is no plastics absent colonialism and the taking of land, because away is always some home, and most often an indigenous one. And because the land on which all of these plants are situated are unceded or stolen lands. I mean, it's the very foundation of any conversation about plastics or paper or toxics. So I will offer Max's work as an example, an exemplar, and a work to think with for sure on this question.
Yeah, I would agree. I just started reading that book. It's not, it'll be out in maybe a few weeks.
I feel like April, maybe April.
Yeah, but she also has there's a website, Discard Studies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You could go to and look at some, I don't know how else to answer that. Johnathan, do you have anything smart to say?
Sometimes I do. Not too much. I will say that, we're working really intentionally about, incorporating, the colonial legacy of the environmental movement, the racist legacy of the environmental movement. And so we're working to reckon with that and, work within that, through that lens. As far as the damming of rivers goes, generally, I mean, my organization doesn't have a position on that because that's not a space we operate in, but like I follow that for fun because that's what I do. And there's a great organization, American Rivers. They're kind of working on this. And I know the Nature Conservancy locally is working on this. The problem with undamming sometimes, not all the time, generally it's good. But if we want to come back to rivers and toxic legacies, oftentimes behind those dams have built up years and decades of sediment that contain all of the gnarly things that Kerri listed off earlier in the talk. And so we have to be mindful if we're going to pull those dams down that we're not going to unleash a torrent of toxins downstream. And for a river like the Blackstone, which at one point I think had like 52 dams for the 52 miles that it runs, that could be problematic for communities. It could be problematic for biodiversity and especially downstream, Narragansett Bay, all of that stuff. So generally I think it's good, but with caveats.
Thoughtfully, generally.
Yeah.
That's
great. So many people did share other very complimentary comments that I will be sending to all of our speakers afterward. But for now, it does seem like we have answered all of the questions. So I'm going to add Anne back into the mix here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time, for your sharing your expertise, and certainly thank you for what you do, because education is key. We still have so much to learn and so much to do, but really thank you for what you do.
Well, thanks for
and I have so many questions, so you'll probably hear from me. I've got your emails, and I'm gonna follow up with you. But again, thank you for being here with us today. So as part of this Valley Talk series, we have 2 more talks coming up. So this series is every other Sunday. So in 2 weeks, on March 7th, we will welcome writer and historical reenactor Paul Bourget, who will examine the Continental Affair, which was a local underground movement that led to the excommunication of 61 church members, and that took place in the city of Woonsocket in the 1920s. And on March 21st, we are going to welcome author David Vermette. He's the author of A Distinct Alien Race, another great book. And he will discuss how the US mainstream perceived French Canadians when they were an immigrant community in New England at the turn of the 20th century.
I will be there for that.
Great.
David's a great guy, great historian.
So, well, enjoy the rest of your Sunday. It's beautiful and sunny here in Cumberland, Rhode Island. I don't know how it is in the rest of the country and the world, but enjoy the day.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Anne. we'll be at your museum as soon as possible, post
Can't
pandemic.
wait.